Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back here to M42's main stage at the inaugural Abu Dhabi Global Healthcare Week. We've had a fantastic start to day one, and we are continuing with our high-level programming. And this particular speaker, well, he comes from my original home country of the UK. Henry Dimbleby is a lead non-executive director at the UK's Department for Food and Agriculture and author of the UK's National Food Strategy. I was speaking to him off stage just a little while ago, and he was telling me about this food strategy being very recent. So without further ado, Henry Dimbleby, please come on stage and join me here at M42's main stage. Please give him a big round of applause. Now, Henry, you're no stranger to the UAE. When did you first come here? What was your involvement about?
So I came here for COP28, and what was interesting about that was that the food system, as we're about to discuss, is by far the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. And yet at Glasgow COP, which was the biodiversity COP, food was not mentioned, so it was absolutely fantastic to see that at COP in Dubai, food was front and center of both the main stage and all of the events around it.
Brilliant. So welcome back to the UAE, welcome to Abu Dhabi, and it's wonderful to have your expertise. Over to you to take us through this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amandeep. So I thought what would be useful, when I was asked to do the food strategy, to write a strategy for government, I realized that when you get to write an independent review, there's a high chance that what happens in there doesn't get done because there is no obligation on the government to do what you recommend. And so what we tried to do was to do two things. We tried to tell a story about how the food system's going wrong, why it's malfunctioned, and then also recommend some policies. That way, when the political appetite is right for intervention, you have both the argument to intervene and the policies there. And we're one of the many countries in the world this year that's having an election. We also then, my wife, Jemima Lewis, who wrote Ravenous with me, which is a book version of the food strategy, she said to me immediately afterwards, no one sane is ever going to read a government document online. We've got to turn this into a book, which we did. And the story that we tell in that book actually talks about how the food system that we have today in many ways is a miracle. And although it does so much harm, that comes from a position of huge human innovation. So up until the Second World War, this chart shows three lines. The green line is the amount of land we farmed globally. The black line is the population of the planet. And the red line is the number of calories we produce. And up until 1945, basically as human population increased, so we dug up more land to feed more people. But scientists after the war, there were 2.8 billion people on the planet, despite all the bloodshed, more than had ever been on the planet before. And they spotted that given improvements in sanitation and in healthcare, that number was likely to increase over the next 50 years to 8 billion. And that caused a problem because there wasn't enough land to dig up. We had already dug up most of the land. So if you go back to the newspapers of the late 40s, early 50s, they are full of stories of Malthusian collapse, of how the population of the planet is going to be limited by the amount of food we eat, and the next 10 decades are going to be, the next 5 decades are going to be marked by wars of resources, by starvation, by mass migration. What those scientists hadn't reckoned on was a man called Norman Borlaug. Borlaug was a botanist. He grew up in the Great Depression in Idaho. He had seen firsthand poverty, and he'd set out on a mission to improve the ability of starving people to get food. He found himself in Mexico at the end of the war, the early 40s, where he was sent by the Rockefeller Foundation to try and improve the farming there. And when he arrived, he wrote to his wife, "These places have clubbed my mind. The quality of the land is so poor, these people are barely struggling to survive. I don't know what to do, but we've got to do something." And what he did was he created a new strain of wheat. He, by hand, hybridized thousands and thousands and thousands of different types of wheat, trying to cross a short-stemmed but low-yielding wheat with a very high-yielding but tall-stemmed wheat, because the high-yielding wheat got blown over in the wind and therefore was actually hopeless as a commercial crop. By stubbornness and also perspiration, he succeeded. This combination of this new wheat plus industrial fertilizer and modern forms of irrigation meant that by the 60s, Mexico was exporting wheat. When he arrived, it had been importing half its wheat. And the experiment was repeated for maize and for grain in the equatorial zones in the southern hemisphere. And this is what the picture looks like today. From slightly less land, because a lot of very poor land fell out of production by the collapse of the Soviet Union, we now have a population of 8 billion and we produce for that population twice the number of calories than we did for 2.8 billion. It's an absolutely astonishing feat of human ingenuity. You wouldn't maybe realize it, but this century, there has not been a famine in a country that was not affected by either political corruption or warfare. We have got, as a species, very good at producing food and shipping it to where it is required. But Borlaug wasn't to know that that system has created problems that we argued in the food strategy are second only to the problems of the energy and transport transition. So first of all, it now completely dominates the environment. One way to look at it, there's Borlaug. We said that in the book that he looked a bit like the actor Jimmy Stewart. He was kind of square-jawed and had good American teeth. But they never made a film about him because you don't get famous for stopping bad things happening. But this food system we have now completely dominates the environment. Just one way to think of that, one lens to put on that, is to look at the weight of all of the wild animals and people on the planet. This is 10,000 BC. This is the beginning of the Holocene, the period of stable climate that enabled agriculture, that enabled planning, that enabled civilization. At the beginning of the Holocene, there were 2.5 million people on the planet, that tiny blue dot, dwarfed by the wild animals, in this case, land-dwelling vertebrates and birds. If you fast forward it to today, it's a very different picture. This is to the same scale. The wild animals now are significantly smaller. That was initially due to our enthusiastic hunting of megafauna, but even since 1970, we have wiped out over 60% of the populations of wild animals globally. The horses, cats, and dogs that we breed as companions and to eat weigh at any one time as much as all the wild animals. And the food that we breed to eat weighs at any one time twice as much as all of the people on the planet and 20 times as much as all of the wild animals. And not surprisingly, this system is by far the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. It's the biggest cause of freshwater stress, freshwater pollution, deforestation, soil degradation, the collapse of aquatic land. And after the energy system, it's the biggest form of greenhouse gas emissions. The most frightening chart that we saw in the whole 2 years that we did this work was this one. Both the UN and the Americans have created a version of this slide. And what it shows is what we expect, given current climate projections, what we expect to happen to yields by 2050. And what you see is wheat in the northern hemisphere is actually expected to increase in yield. It likes carbon dioxide as a feedstock. It likes warmth. It likes wetness, although in Europe, certainly, this winter has been so wet that yields are down about 16%. So it's a complex system. Nothing is certain. But if you look at the equatorial zones in the global south, maize and rice yields are expected to fall. And that might be slowly or it might be catastrophically. So the Mekong Delta, for example, which is the biggest rice exporting area to the world, half of it will be underwater if sea levels rise a meter. And this, to me, looks like the concerns of 1945. This chart looks like wars of resources, starvation, and mass migration. And it's not only the environment that the food system is going to hurt. It's also our health. So already today, this is causes of avoidable ill health, and the purple ones are dietary risks. Already today, globally, diet is by far the largest cause of avoidable ill health, dwarfing smoking. In the UK, we think that by 2035, treating type 2 diabetes alone, which is one condition of ill health, is going to cost our NHS more than treating all cancers does today. And so if you play that forward, what it looks like is a society where the health service is sucking in more and more money, where productivity is down. We have more people out of work now across Europe and in America and in Canada. I don't know the statistics for the Middle East, with diet-related diseases. Tax receipts go down and we become both impoverished and sick. And it's a problem that is visited particularly on the poor. So this shows for preventable mortality, heart disease, cancer, dental decay, childhood overweight. The left-hand side is the richest 10%. The right-hand side is the poorest 10%. So it's a problem across all society, particularly visited on the poor. And this is why, if you look at the food system, this is the other great transition that society needs to go through. On the left-hand side of this chart, you see global GDP. Food is 12.5% of global GDP, about $12.5 trillion. It employs over a third of the global population. And then on the right-hand side, the estimated harms in terms of health, environment, and social, $12.7 trillion. So the food system that we have today does as much damage. It basically costs us twice what we pay at the till. So the question is, what do you do about that? How do you do something about that? And one of the great things about working on a government review is that you get, particularly during COVID, to ring up anyone in the world, get them on a Zoom call, and get them talking about how on earth you solve it. And the first thing that, and we got people from Brazil, from Russia, from America, from the Middle East, from Egypt, all over the place to focusing. I have focus groups on food security, on trade, on health. But all of them to start with said you need to take a systems approach. This is what you need to do. And we were like, great, okay, good. What does that look like? What is it? What is a systems approach? And interestingly there, the experts slightly differed on what they said. A lot of them showed us this chart. So this is known as the Foresight Obesity Map. There's an excellent quiz on the Washington Post website where there are scientists who spend their whole life giving spiders recreational drugs and then seeing what kind of webs they make. And on the Washington Post website, they show you the webs and you have to guess what spider made what web. It's quite easy on the whole. The spider on marijuana just doesn't really do anything. The spider on LSD creates a beautiful fractal pattern. And the spider on Speed's web looks a bit like this. This is meant to be mapping every single cause of obesity. So your demographics, the society, your place, and showing that it's complicated. But as a tool to get politicians to act, it's pretty hopeless because A, where do you start? And B, they look at that and they think, I'll try something simpler. What really helped us, and it was the chief scientific officer at DEFRA who helped this, was the science of system dynamics. Actually started at MIT in the early 50s. It's one of the few sciences that's gone from business into biology. So the way in which people think about feedback loops and systems in biology and biological ecosystems was actually informed by work that was done on the supply chains of computer manufacturers in the 1950s. And what system dynamics says is you need to focus on the feedback loops, try and find the feedback loops that are going wrong, like the major feedback loops that are going wrong, and fix those first. And luckily, in this space, there are two feedback loops that are so obviously malfunctioning that they're pretty obvious to spot. One of them was called by Siddhartha Dasgupta in his extraordinary work, The Economics of Biodiversity, the invisibility of nature. So he pointed out that not only do we not really try to measure nature, it's not you can't count it in your wallet. It's not in the balance sheet of companies. It's not in the way we measure GDP. It's actually worse than that. We subsidize to the tune of $500 billion in subsidies to industrial agriculture, fisheries, and fossil fuel companies globally. We subsidize the destruction of nature to the tune of $4 to $6 trillion. And so he says we shouldn't be surprised if we are destroying our natural capital at such a rate if we're paying people to destroy it. Of course they're going to be destroying it. And so actually, theoretically, the solution on nature is quite simple. You start charging for it and stop paying people to destroy it. The second feedback loop is actually also, when it's set out for you, pretty obvious. We called it the junk food cycle. If you look at our appetite evolved. It's ancient. So the amygdala, which controls our desires for things, evolved before we had separated by certain forms of marine worm that live in the mud outside my house in Devon. It is a very ancient part of your brain. And the appetite, which feeds through the amygdala, which tells you what kinds of food to eat, when to eat them, how hungry you are, when you're satiated, effectively evolved to make it, to reward you in a calorie-restrained world for seeking out calories, for braving bee stings to get a honey nest, for chasing an antelope for a long time. And so we get huge pleasure from foods that are fatty, sugary, and salty. And when they have a very specific quality in that they are soft, calorie-dense, not without a lot of water in, and low in insoluble fiber, three things that you don't find in foods cooked from scratch, they fill you up less quickly than food cooked from scratch. And so food companies have noticed that we love those kinds of foods, and they have increasingly spent their research and development and marketing money on those foods. And they have spent that money, we've eaten more, they spent more, we've eaten more, they spent more, we've eaten more, and we've got sick. And to give you a bit of the scale to which this kind of food has overtaken our environment, 85% of the products sold by the top 7 fast-moving consumer goods companies are deemed by the World Health Organization to be unsuitable to market to children. We just live in a swamp, in a world that is designed to make us sick. And it's not because the CEOs of these companies are bad people. They didn't realize it started off in the 70s as, a bit of fun, a present for the kids. But as the commercial incentive, their commercial incentive, has interacted with our evolved appetite, you've got what's called an escalating feedback loop. It's just got more and more and more and more until the system has become absolutely swamped by this stuff. And this is what it looks like on the supermarket shelves. This is 2 huge multinational businesses fighting it out at children's eye level on a supermarket shelf for a share of our wallet to feed our children for breakfast something that just isn't food, that isn't nutritious for them, and in the end will rot their teeth, give them diabetes, and lead to an early death. So how does a state respond to that? Because that was what I was asked to do. And we came up with 4 imperatives which had policy actions against it. And in the UK, just kind of briefly, I'd say, the government is doing all of the environmental ones and none of the health ones. So we said, first of all, you have to attack the junk food cycle. So we recommended restrictions on advertising. We recommended a salt and sugar reformulation tax. We argued that, and in fact, all of the CEOs of the big companies agreed behind the scenes that there was no way they could do it without regulation because someone else would just do bad stuff. And actually, interestingly, last week, the CEOs of Nestle and Danone said that in public for the first time. We need government regulation. We then said, you also, bearing in mind that we have this unequal society, you need in the short term to support the diets of people who are living in poverty through benefits in kind, free school meals during the holidays, free fruit and veg. On the environment side, we have to realize that land is the scarce asset. 75% of the land we use globally for farming is used to grow crops, to feed to animals and to graze animals. It's just an incredibly inefficient way to feed ourselves. We now need that land. We had millions of years of sunlight stored up in the form of fossil fuels. It's a great place to make this argument. And we now need to wean ourselves off that, and we need more from our land. So you need to have a land use framework and regulations to make sure that we're using land for the right things. And then finally, we need to create a long-term shift in food culture. Some people say that's not possible, but actually, when I talk to kids, when I was a kid, you could smoke on airplanes. Amazing. And if you look at the food cultures of Japan, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, they have all resisted this junk food cycle, all through heavy government intervention. I think it is possible. It's possible that we'll look back in 20 years' time and think, wow, that was the time when we ate that stuff. So, just ending by what's going to happen in the future. On the junk food cycle, I think we go one of two ways. I talked a lot about the feedback loop between appetite and the commercial incentive and how you tackle the commercial incentive. The other thing you can do is tackle appetite. So semaglutide, which is Wegovy, Ozempic, is the first of many, many appetite-suppressing drugs that will come down the line over the next 20 years. I think they will be incredibly valuable for people who really struggle genetically. About 70% of obesity is genetic. But it is not the right way to solve the problem. At the moment, the fast-moving consumer goods companies are terrified by this. The pharma companies are licking their lips because this is big money. And the insurers are the ones going, we can't just move the profit from one sector to the other. The insurers are trying to create systemic solutions. And I do think, so the question is, will governments then be prepared to intervene? I do think they might, and I think I've become particularly obsessed by this man recently, who's called Eddie Abu. And he's gone from 0 to 4 million on Insta over the last 3 months, simply by walking down supermarket aisles with his phone and going, look at this sugary rubbish. He'll go down a mother's aisle, look at this. You're going to buy this for your mother on Mother's Day? You want to kill her? You want to kill her and get her insurance prematurely? And then he just turns around to the camera and says, wake up, although he swears, but I was told I shouldn't swear. So he says, wake up. And I do think there is a chance now that we will wake up and we will try not only to follow the drug solution, but also to follow the cultural solution. And I hope that everyone here can take some of this back to their countries. If you are in policy, let me know. I'd love to help you work on the policy for your country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Henry. I think that definitely woke us all up. There's so many interesting points there. I have very clear ideas of the threads I'd like to pull with you, but I'm going to ask the audience. Questions for Henry Dimbleby while we have him on stage. Anybody got any questions? Okay, I will ask you a question. Henry, you talk with a lot of international experience. You get an insight in terms of different international governments and how they're working on these issues. Where have you found the best case models outside the UK? You mentioned earlier there the Japan model.
So I think fundamentally the two transitions are largely separate, the environmental transition and the health transition. And for the environmental transition, it's very, very different depending on where you are. So if you are in the UK, for example, we happen to be an island that could feed itself from its own resources if it needed to. If you're in Egypt, where already you're importing half your wheat from the Ukraine and your population is going to double over the next 30 years, you have a very different solution. So I think that actually we need a land use framework globally to resolve this. You're not people say, oh, we should grow food locally, but you're not going to move the whole half the population of Egypt to Ukraine. So we need to be thinking about how the role global trade plays, what needs to be grown where. And I think for a country like this one, really looking into artificial proteins, precision fermentation, vertical farming, so you can grow as much here as you can. And I think there's kind of, actually, the UAE is doing really interesting stuff on that. On health, I think the best examples are, there's some emerging stuff in Amsterdam, but the best examples are probably the ones that I mentioned, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore.
That's really interesting, and I think it's great to have that overview that you have.
Yeah, and there's something about, so we're trying to work out why, like who intervenes and why they intervene. Because it's not an Asian thing, so there are lots of Asian countries that haven't intervened, it's been a problem. And I've increasingly thought it's actually about existential risk. So if you are a country like the UK, you can kind of have a luxury belief in libertarianism, that you can kind of let the market do things because the problems that causes aren't existential. Whereas if you are a country living south of a nuclear power, or that opened up in the 19th century and saw that, as the Japanese did, saw they were tiny compared to the rest of everyone who came to visit, or you're an island like Singapore. So I think there is something about existential risk that creates much more determined action than in soggy European countries.
And I think that's fascinating, because one of the threads I was going to pull on is that idea there's a moral, philosophical and conceptual thinking behind a lot of these strategies. They aren't simply in isolation about reducing obesity. It's a question of when does a government, when does a leadership intervene? What is the role of a leadership?
I mean, when is a really interesting question. So this system is literally not sustainable. So we cannot continue to grow food in the way we do, or we will not be able to grow it. And if we continue to eat in the way we do, we won't be able to afford healthcare. So the question then is, how much harm needs to happen? How obvious does it have to become before people take action? And I think COP here was amazing for this. I think on the environment side, we are probably 20 years ahead in terms of that thinking than we are on the health side. Whereas, interestingly, the health harms that are happening today are horrendous. More people died in the UK, more people die every year in the UK from diet than died during COVID from COVID.
Which is extraordinary, and that kind of information doesn't get out there. I know that we are down to time on the session, but just to maybe have this as our final point, you use that word harm there, and we've talked earlier about dispelling myths that are in mainstream media and social media, etc. And I think that's why events like this and stages like this are so crucial. Having international experts and our talent here in the UAE speak from their expertise and experience as well. The screen you had there earlier about appetite suppressors, we don't need to advertise anymore for that particular drug. But we simply don't have the data to prove the long-term impact of those. So really, we need to ensure that people are provided with the right information.
Yeah, I think you cannot rely, I don't think information cuts it, so people are when they go to the supermarket, 95% of people don't have time to think about the environment or really health. They're just bombarded by untrue health messages. So I think it is about government intervention, and I think the data is there for action now. And I would finally say that I lived in Japan for a lot of people say this is a cultural thing. I lived in Japan for a year back in 2002, and I actually came to believe that culturally we are much, much more similar than we are different. A lot of it is veneer, and we can learn a lot from each other about how to serve these things.
We could definitely learn a lot more from you, Henry. I am looking at the clock, which is down to 0. Otherwise, I have a few more questions to ask. But I think that's a really astute point to end on, that actually the role of governments and leadership is really important in getting the right information to the public as well across the world. So thank you very much for outlining that. Henry Dimbleby, please give him a big round of applause for that wonderful session. We're going to be back in 2 minutes' time for another panel discussion. Thank you for staying with us. Henry, we'll take a little photo with you before you leave the stage. If I get Father, our photographer, who's been wonderful in ensuring that we document everything. Oh, we have our colleague. Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic.